The champagne glass slipped from my daughter-in-law's hand the moment she hit the floor. Jessica's mother, Helen, was convulsing on my marble kitchen floor, foam collecting at the corners of her mouth, and all I could think was, well, that wasn't supposed to happen to her. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Before I tell you how I got to this point, let me be clear about something. I've spent 70 years on this earth, and I didn't survive a ruthless business world by being stupid. When someone tries to poison you at your own retirement party, you notice. Especially when that someone has been eyeing your bank account like a starving woman stares at a feast. 2 hours earlier, my kitchen had been full of laughter and celebration. I'd just sold my consulting firm for $23 million. Not bad for a company I'd built from nothing after my husband died 15 years ago. Michael, my son, had insisted on throwing this party. "Mom, you deserve to celebrate," he'd said, those sincere brown eyes of his working overtime. "Let Jessica handle everything. You just relax and enjoy." I should have known something was wrong when Jessica volunteered to play hostess. The woman who usually complained about loading the dishwasher was suddenly Martha Stewart incarnate, arranging flowers and polishing crystal like her life depended on it. Which, as it turned out, it probably did. The party was lovely, I'll give her that. About 30 people from my professional life, a few neighbors, and family. Jessica had even hired a bartender. "Nothing's too good for you, Sarah," she'd gushed, squeezing my arm with those perfectly manicured nails that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. I was making small talk with my former business partner when I saw it. Jessica, standing near the champagne table, glancing around nervously before pulling a small vial from her purse. My blood turned to ice as I watched her empty the contents into a specific glass, the one with the tiny chip on the rim that I always used at parties. Now, a sensible person might have screamed, might have called the police, might have confronted her right there. But I've learned that sometimes the best way to catch a snake is to let it think it's cornered a mouse. So I smiled, nodded at whatever my business partner was saying about market trends, and kept watching. Jessica picked up my doctored champagne and began walking toward me, her face a mask of daughterly concern. "Sarah, you look tired," she said, offering me the glass. "Here, have some champagne. You've earned it." I took the glass, thanked her warmly, and waited. About 10 minutes later, when she was distracted showing off her new tennis bracelet to the neighbors, I quietly switched glasses with her mother, Helen, who was standing nearby, looking rather lost without a drink. Helen had always been a bit scattered. Poor thing. She grabbed the nearest glass without thinking, the one I just placed next to her purse. Within 5 minutes, she was complimenting the champagne's interesting flavor and asking if I'd ordered it from somewhere special. The rest, as they say, happened rather quickly. I knelt beside Helen while Jessica screamed for someone to call 911. Her performance of shocked devastation almost convincing. Almost. The problem with being a murderer is that genuine panic and fake panic look very different when you know what to watch for. "What happened?" my son Michael demanded, pushing through the small crowd that had gathered. His face was pale, but I caught something else in his expression. A quick glance toward Jessica that lasted just a fraction too long. "I don't know," Jessica sobbed, clutching my arm. "She just collapsed. 1 minute she was fine, the next—" She gestured helplessly at her mother, who was now unconscious but still breathing. Thank God. The paramedics arrived within minutes. As they worked on Helen, loading her onto a stretcher, I found myself studying my son's face. 32 years of motherhood had taught me to read his moods like weather patterns. Right now, he looked like a man watching his carefully laid plans crumble in real time. "Which hospital?" I asked the lead paramedic. "St. Mary's. Are you family?" "Close friend," I said, glancing meaningfully at Jessica, who was too busy hyperventilating to notice. "I'll follow in my car." Michael stepped forward quickly. "Mom, you don't need to do that. We'll handle everything. You should stay here. Clean up from the party." How thoughtful. Keep the target at home while they figured out what went wrong with their little plan. "Nonsense," I said firmly. "Helen is practically family. I'm coming." I grabbed my purse and keys before anyone could argue. At the hospital, I made sure to stay close enough to overhear the medical staff's conversations. Helen's condition was listed as acute poisoning, cause unknown. The doctor mentioned something about plant alkaloids to the nurse, specific enough to make me think someone had done their homework on untraceable toxins. Jessica paced the waiting room, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum like a metronome counting down her anxiety. Michael sat rigidly in a plastic chair, his phone buzzing constantly with texts he seemed reluctant to answer. "This is just terrible," Jessica said for the 5th time. "Poor Mom. I can't understand how this happened." I patted her shoulder sympathetically. "These things are often mysterious, dear. I'm sure the doctors will figure it out." Then I added, almost casually, "You know, it's lucky she didn't drink much of that champagne. She only had a few sips before she collapsed." Jessica's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Champagne? You think the champagne caused this?" "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," I said with a dismissive wave. "Just an old woman's mind looking for patterns where there aren't any." But Jessica's face had gone a shade paler, and her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee. Michael was watching our conversation with the intensity of a hawk studying field mice. 3 hours later, a doctor emerged to tell us Helen was stable but would need to stay overnight for observation. The tests were inconclusive, he said, but whatever she'd ingested was slowly working its way out of her system. "Can we see her?" Jessica asked. "Family only, and she's sedated. Best to come back tomorrow." As we left the hospital, Michael walked me to my car. "Mom, maybe you should stay with us tonight, eh? After what happened, I'd feel better if you weren't alone." How considerate. Especially since Helen's little medical emergency had probably left them wondering if I suspected anything. The answer was yes. Absolutely I did. But they didn't need to know that yet. "That's sweet of you, dear, but I'll be fine. I have that new security system, remember?" I kissed his cheek and got into my car, watching in my rearview mirror as he and Jessica had what looked like an urgent, whispered conversation in the parking lot. Back home, I poured myself a real glass of champagne, from a fresh bottle naturally, and settled into my study. Time to figure out exactly what my loving family had planned for me, and more importantly, what I was going to do about it. I spent the night doing something I'd become quite good at in 45 years of business. Research. Not the kind you do with computers and databases, the kind you do with a clear memory and a suspicious mind. Helen's poisoning wasn't random, and it certainly wasn't an accident. Someone had planned to kill me at my own party, probably hoping to make it look like a heart attack or stroke. At 70, those things happen. No one questions a successful woman's heart giving out from the stress of selling her life's work. But why? That was the $23 million question, wasn't it? I made coffee at 5 in the morning and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down everything I knew about Michael and Jessica's financial situation. It wasn't pretty. Michael's architectural firm had been struggling since the recession, and Jessica's boutique jewelry business was more hobby than profit center. They lived well, too well for their actual income. Their mortgage on that ridiculous house in Westfield was 3 times what they could reasonably afford. The BMW and Mercedes in their driveway weren't paid for. Jessica's shopping habits alone could fund a small country's education budget. I'd help them, of course. What mother wouldn't? A few thousand here and there when Michael mentioned they were tight some months. The down payment on the house when Jessica cried about wanting to start a family in the right neighborhood. Private school tuition for Emma when they insisted public schools weren't good enough. Looking at my checkbook records, I'd given them nearly $200,000 over the past 5 years. Gifts, I'd called them. Investments in their happiness. Never loans. That would have been tacky. But now I was wondering if they'd seen those gifts differently. Less like motherly generosity and more like advance payments on an inheritance they couldn't wait to collect. The phone rang at 7:30. Jessica, calling to check on me. "Sarah, I couldn't sleep all night thinking about you," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "After what happened to Mom, I just worry that maybe there was something wrong with the food or drinks. You didn't feel sick at all, did you?" How thoughtful of her to check whether her poison had found its intended target. "Not at all, dear. I feel fine. Have you heard anything more about Helen? The doctors say she should be able to go home today. They think maybe she ate something that disagreed with her before the party. You know how she is with her medications. She probably took something on an empty stomach." Helen Peterson was many things, but careless with medication wasn't one of them. The woman organized her pills like a military operation, complete with labeled containers and smartphone reminders. That's such a relief, I said. I was worried it might have been something at the party. That would have been terrible. Oh no, definitely not, Jessica said quickly. The doctors were very clear it wasn't food poisoning, just one of those things. Interesting how quickly she wanted to shut down any investigation into what happened at my house, almost as if she was worried someone might test the remaining champagne. After hanging up, I walked to my kitchen and looked at the bottle Jessica had opened for the party, still 3/4 full, sitting innocently on my counter. I wondered what would happen if I had it tested at a lab. Not that I needed proof for myself, I knew what I'd seen. But evidence might be useful later. My doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. Michael stood on my front porch holding a box of pastries from my favorite bakery, looking every inch the concerned son. "Thought you might want some breakfast," he said, kissing my cheek. "You probably didn't eat much yesterday after everything that happened." I let him in and made fresh coffee while he arranged the pastries on a plate. Watching him move around my kitchen, opening cupboards he'd known since childhood, reaching for sugar without asking where it was kept, I felt a strange sadness. This was still my little boy, the one who used to bring me dandelions and proudly display his elementary school artwork on my refrigerator. When had that boy turned into a man who stood by while his wife tried to murder his mother? "How are you holding up, Mom?" he asked, settling across from me at the breakfast table. "Oh, you know me. Takes more than a little excitement to rattle these old bones." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's what I was afraid of. An odd thing to say. I sipped my coffee and waited. "The thing is," Michael continued, picking at a Danish, "Jessica and I have been talking about your situation." "My situation? You're 70 years old, Mom, living alone in this big house, all that money from the sale." He gestured vaguely. "It just seems like a lot for one person to manage." There it was, the setup for whatever they had planned next. "I appreciate your concern, dear," I said, keeping my voice light. "But I've been managing quite well so far." Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Have you, though? I mean, yesterday's accident with Helen? What if that had been you? What if you'd collapsed, and no one found you for hours?" The audacity was breathtaking. He was using their failed murder attempt as an argument for why I needed their protection. "Michael, Helen collapsed at a party with 30 witnesses and paramedics arrived in minutes. I'd hardly call that a cautionary tale about living alone. That's not what I meant." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he was about to ask for something he knew I'd refuse. "Look, Jessica and I have been doing some research. There are some really nice communities for active seniors. Places where you'd have people around, activities, medical staff on site." Ah, the nursing home pitch. How convenient that they'd already been researching options for me. "How thoughtful," I said. "And I suppose you found something specific in mind?" "Actually, yes." He pulled out his phone and showed me a glossy website. "Sunset Manor. It's only 20 minutes from our house, so we could visit all the time. They have a golf course, a spa, cultural activities. It's more like a resort than a retirement home." I studied the pictures of smiling elderly people playing bridge and doing water aerobics. Everyone looked so peaceful and content, probably because they were heavily medicated. "The only thing is," Michael continued, "there's usually a waiting list. But if someone wanted to move in quickly, they'd need to pay the full entrance fee up front. It's significant, about $400,000, but it covers everything. Housing, meals, medical care for life. $400,000. That would make a nice dent in my liquid assets, wouldn't it? And once I was safely tucked away in Sunset Manor, who would have power of attorney over the remaining $22 million? Who would be making decisions about my care and my money?" "It sounds lovely," I said. "But you know, I'm quite happy here. This house holds so many memories of your father. Mom, Dad's been gone 15 years. Don't you think it's time to start a new chapter?" The gentle concern in his voice made my heart ache. If I hadn't seen what I'd seen last night, I might have actually considered his suggestion. My son, worried about his aging mother, wanting to make sure she was safe and cared for. It would have been touching. Instead, it was terrifying. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "It's a big decision." Michael's relief was visible. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Maybe we could drive out there next week." "Just to look around?" "Maybe." I stood up and began clearing the breakfast dishes. "You know, I should call Helen today. Make sure she's feeling better. Actually, Mom, Jessica asked me to tell you that Helen probably needs to rest for a few days. The doctor said visitors might be too stimulating while she recovers. How convenient. Keep me away from the victim until the evidence is out of her system and she can't remember details clearly. After Michael left, I sat in my study and thought about timing. They'd waited until after I sold the company to make their move. Smart. If I'd died 6 months ago, my $23 million would have gone to Michael in my will anyway. But as a gift from a living person, it would face different tax implications. Killing me now, especially if they could manufacture signs of declining mental capacity first, would give them grounds to challenge any recent changes to my estate plans. The phone rang. My attorney, David Hartwell, returning a call I'd made earlier. Sarah, good to hear from you. How was the retirement party? Eventful, I said. David, I need to see you. Soon. Is everything all right? I looked out my study window at the garden my husband had planted 20 years ago. The roses were blooming beautifully, despite having no one to tend them, but an old woman who apparently couldn't be trusted to manage her own life. I'm not sure, I said, but I think I'm about to find out. David Hartwell had been my attorney for 20 years, which meant he'd seen me through my husband's death, the building of my business, and every major decision since. A thin, precise man who kept his emotions carefully controlled, David was exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted when you suspected your family was trying to kill you. His office overlooked downtown from the 15th floor, all dark wood and leather chairs designed to inspire confidence. I'd always felt safe here, surrounded by law books and the subtle smell of expensive cologne. Tell me everything, David said after his secretary brought us coffee and closed the door. I told him. Every detail from the party, Helen's collapse, Michael's visit this morning. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. You're certain about what you saw? He asked when I finished. As certain as I am that I'm sitting in this chair. David leaned back, tapping his pen against his lips. The problem is proving intent. Jessica could claim she was adding something harmless to the champagne, a supplement, a flavoring, something personal. Without testing the remaining champagne, we have no evidence of attempted murder. Then let's test it. If we find poison, we have proof she attempted to kill someone. But we still can't prove she intended to kill you specifically. She could claim she was targeting her own mother for insurance money, or that it was meant for someone else entirely. I hadn't considered that angle. So even with proof of poisoning, they could escape a murder charge? Attempted murder, yes. But Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss. David's expression grew serious. If they're willing to kill you for your money, they might try other approaches first. Legal challenges to your competency, for instance. On what grounds? Your age, living alone, the stress of selling your business? If they can establish a pattern of declining judgment or mental capacity, they could petition for guardianship. Once they control your person, they control your assets. The nursing home suggestion suddenly made more sense. Get me isolated, surrounded by medical professionals who might be willing to document signs of confusion or dementia, especially if those professionals were being paid well for their observations. What do I need to do? David opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder. First, we document your current mental state. I'll arrange for you to be evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist, someone who specializes in competency assessments for elderly clients. Get that on record immediately. And then? Then we get creative with your estate planning. David's smile was sharp. If Michael and Jessica want to play games with your money, let's make sure they're playing by your rules. We spent the next 2 hours going over options. Trust structures that would make it difficult for anyone to challenge my decisions. Medical directives that specified exactly who could and couldn't make healthcare decisions on my behalf. Financial arrangements that would trigger automatic audits if anyone attempted to access my accounts without proper authorization. There's one more thing, David said as I prepared to leave. Given what you've told me about last night, I think you should consider your personal safety. If they tried once, they'll try again. Probably more carefully next time. I thought about Michael's suggestion that I stay with them last night. How convenient that would have been. A grieving widow, distraught over a friend's sudden illness, perhaps taking a sedative to help her sleep. So easy for an elderly woman to accidentally take too many pills. What do you recommend? Security cameras for starters, motion sensors, a panic button system. I can recommend a company that specializes in protection for high net worth individuals. High net worth individuals. That's what I was now, apparently. Rich enough to kill for. Driving home, I found myself studying every car in my rearview mirror, wondering if I was being followed. Paranoia. Probably. But as my husband used to say, you're not paranoid if they're really after you. My phone rang as I pulled into my garage. Jessica, her voice bright with artificial cheer. Sarah, I wanted to let you know Mom's home from the hospital. She's feeling much better, though she doesn't remember much about last night. The doctor said that's normal with this kind of incident. How perfectly convenient. I'm so glad she's all right. I'd love to visit her tomorrow. Oh, she's really not up for visitors yet. Maybe in a few days? I'll let you know. Of course, dear. Just tell her I'm thinking of her. After hanging up, I sat in my car for a long moment, looking at the house I'd called home for 30 years. My husband and I had bought it when Michael was 10, full of dreams about family dinners and holiday gatherings. The mortgage had been a stretch then, but we'd been young and optimistic, certain that everything would work out. Now it felt like a fortress under siege, but I'd been in business long enough to know that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Time to show my family what a 70-year-old woman was really capable of. The security company arrived at 8 the next morning. 3 technicians in unmarked vans who spent the day installing cameras, motion detectors, and a panic button system that could summon police in under 3 minutes. I told the neighbors I'd been having problems with package theft. A believable enough story in any suburban neighborhood. By afternoon, my house was better protected than most jewelry stores. But the real security came from the envelope David's messenger delivered at 2 o'clock. My updated will, trust documents, and medical directives all properly witnessed and notarized. If Michael and Jessica wanted my money, they'd have to wait for it, and they'd get a lot less than they expected. The new will cut Michael's inheritance from everything to a modest trust fund that would pay him $50,000 a year for life, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to fund their current lifestyle. The bulk of my estate would go to cancer research, with smaller amounts to several charities I'd supported over the years. As for Jessica, she got nothing, not a penny. I'd never liked the woman, but I'd tolerated her for Michael's sake. Attempted murder, however, was where I drew the line. I was reading through the documents one final time when my doorbell rang. Through the security monitor, I could see Michael and Jessica standing on my front porch, both looking somewhat grim. "Mom, we need to talk," Michael said when I opened the door. "Of course. Dear, come in." They settled in my living room, Jessica perched on the edge of the sofa like she might need to run at any moment. Michael looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the new security camera in the corner. "New camera?" he asked. "Package theft," I said smoothly. "You can't be too careful these days." Jessica cleared her throat. "Sarah, we've been thinking about what happened the other night, with Mom's accident." "Yes? Well, it's just that we feel terrible about having the party here. If something we brought caused her to get sick..." She trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I watched this performance with professional appreciation. Jessica had clearly been practicing. "I'm sure it wasn't anything you brought, dear. But what if it was?" Michael leaned forward. "What if there was something wrong with the champagne, or the food, or..." "Mom, I'd never forgive myself if we'd accidentally put you in danger." Here it came, the setup for whatever they'd planned next. "The point is," Jessica said, "we think it might be better if we took care of you for a while, just until we're sure you're safe." "Took care of me how?" "Well, you could stay with us," Michael said. "Just temporarily, until we figure out what happened the other night." I let the silence stretch, watching their faces. Michael looked genuinely worried. He'd always been good at convincing himself his motivations were pure. Jessica looked like a woman whose mortgage payment was overdue. "That's very thoughtful," I said finally, "but I'm perfectly safe here." "Are you, though?" Jessica's voice took on an edge. "You're 70 years old, Sarah, living alone. What if something happens and no one finds you for days?" The same argument Michael had made yesterday. They were working from a script. "What if you have a fall?" Michael added. "Or a heart attack? Mom, at your age, anything could happen." "At my age," as if 70 meant I was already dead and just hadn't noticed yet. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "you're absolutely right. Anything could happen at my age. That's exactly why I spent the day updating my will. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Your will? Jessica's voice was carefully neutral. Oh yes. It's amazing how a brush with mortality, even someone else's, makes you think about these things. I realized my old will was terribly out of date. Michael's face had gone pale. What kind of updates? I smiled at him. The same smile I'd used when he was 8 years old and I'd caught him lying about breaking my favorite vase. Oh, just some minor adjustments to reflect my current priorities. You know how these things go. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear their minds racing, trying to figure out how badly their plans had just been disrupted. Well, Jessica said finally, her voice tight. I'm sure whatever you decided was for the best. I think so too, dear. They left shortly after, promising to check on me soon. I watched from my security monitor as they sat in their car in my driveway for 10 minutes, having what looked like a very intense conversation. Then Jessica made a phone call. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her gesturing angrily. Michael kept trying to take the phone away from her, and she kept pushing his hand aside. When they finally drove away, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my favorite chair. Tomorrow, I would implement phase 2 of my plan. But tonight, I was going to enjoy the first peaceful evening I'd had in days. After all, there's something deeply satisfying about watching your enemies realize they've underestimated you. The game was just beginning, and I'd been playing it a lot longer than they had. The next morning brought a visitor I wasn't expecting. Helen Peterson stood on my doorstep, looking pale but determined, clutching a small purse like a lifeline. Sarah, I need to talk to you, she said without preamble. It's about the other night. I invited her in and made tea, studying her face for signs of the poisoning. She looked tired but alert, certainly more coherent than her daughter would have liked me to believe. Jessica told me I had some kind of reaction to medication, Helen said, settling into my living room chair. But Sarah, I don't take any medications except vitamins, haven't for years. Interesting. What do you remember about the party? Everything, until I started feeling dizzy. I remember the champagne tasting strange, bitter, almost metallic. And I remember seeing Jessica near the drinks table earlier, doing something with a small bottle. My pulse quickened. What kind of bottle? Like an eyedropper bottle, the kind you'd use for essential oils or other things. Helen's hands shook slightly as she set down her teacup. Sarah, I think my daughter tried to poison you. Why would you think that? Helen's laugh was bitter. Because she's been talking about your money for months, how unfair it is that you have so much and they struggle, how much easier their lives would be if something happened to you. The pieces were falling into place. Has she said anything specific? Last month, she asked me if I thought you'd updated your will recently. She seemed very concerned about Michael's inheritance. Helen met my eyes. Sarah, I think they've been planning this for a while. I made a decision. Helen deserved to know what her daughter had tried to do, and I needed an ally who'd witnessed their behavior firsthand. Helen, I saw Jessica put something in my champagne glass. I switched our drinks deliberately. The color drained from her face. She tried to kill you, and I almost died instead. Yes. We sat in silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of what had happened. What are you going to do? Helen asked finally. I'm going to give them exactly what they want, I said. Just not the way they expect to get it. Helen raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? It means your daughter and my son are about to learn that some games have higher stakes than they realized. After Helen left, I made a phone call to an old business contact. Patricia Williams ran a private investigation firm that specialized in corporate espionage and background checks. We'd worked together several times over the years when I needed information about potential business partners. Sarah Wilson. Patricia's voice was warm through the phone. I heard about your sale. Congratulations. Thank you. Patricia, I need a favor, a personal one. What kind of favor? I need to know everything about my son's finances, bank accounts, credit cards, loans, investments, everything. There was a pause. Sarah, are you sure? Sometimes family information can be uncomfortable. I'm sure. Give me 48 hours. While Patricia worked her magic, I implemented the next phase of my plan. I called Michael and asked him to meet me for lunch at our old restaurant, the place we'd celebrated his graduation from architecture school, his wedding, Emma's birth. He arrived looking nervous, constantly checking his phone. "How are you feeling, Mom? You sounded upset when you called." "I've been thinking about what you and Jessica said, about my safety, about planning for the future." His face brightened. "And?" "I think you're right. I think it's time to make some changes." Michael leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of changes?" "Well, I've been looking into Sunset Manor, the place you mentioned. I called them this morning." "That's wonderful, Mom. I think you'll really like it there. They do have an opening, but it needs to be filled quickly. Someone else is interested in the same unit." "How quickly?" "Next week. I'd need to pay the entrance fee by Friday to secure it." Michael's excitement was palpable. "That's not a problem, is it? You have the money from the sale." "Of course I do. It's just, well, it's a big step. I thought maybe you and Jessica could help me with the paperwork. Make sure I'm making the right decision." "Absolutely. We'd be happy to help." I smiled at my son, memorizing his face. In a few days, that eager expression would change to something very different. "There's just one thing," I added casually. "The facility requires all residents to have a power of attorney on file. Someone to make decisions if they become unable to. I was hoping you'd be willing to take that on." "Of course, Mom. Whatever you need." "Perfect." Michael thought he was maneuvering me into giving him control of my money. Instead, he was walking directly into my trap. Patricia called Thursday morning with her report. I listened in growing amazement as she detailed Michael and Jessica's financial situation. It was worse than I'd imagined. "They're leveraged to the hilt," Patricia said. "The house has been refinanced 3 times. They have 2 mortgages, plus a home equity line of credit that's maxed out. Credit card debt exceeding $80,000. "How have they been making payments?" "Barely. Michael's business has been operating at a loss for 2 years. They've been using credit cards to pay other credit cards. Classic signs of financial desperation." "Anything else?" "Jessica took out a life insurance policy on you 6 months ago. $500,000, with her listed as beneficiary." My blood turned to ice. "How is that legal?" "She claimed insurable interest as your daughter-in-law and caregiver. The insurance company probably assumed Michael was the actual beneficiary and Jessica was just handling the paperwork." "A life insurance policy. They'd been planning my death for months, not days." "There's one more thing. Sarah. Michael's been making regular payments to someone named Dr. Richard Steinberg, a geriatric psychiatrist." "For what?" "I'm not sure yet, but the payments started 3 months ago. Small amounts, like consultation fees." "Dr. Richard Steinberg. I made a note to ask David about him." That afternoon, Michael and Jessica arrived at my house with a briefcase full of paperwork for Sunset Manor. They spread the documents across my dining room table like generals planning a battle. "This is the admission contract," Jessica explained, pointing to a thick stack of papers. "And this is the financial disclosure form. It lists all your assets so they can calculate your monthly fees." "It's very thorough," I observed, scanning the documents. "They'd want access to all my accounts, all my investments, everything." "The power of attorney paperwork is here," Michael added, sliding another document toward me. "It's pretty standard. Just gives me the authority to handle your financial affairs if you can't." I read through the power of attorney document carefully. It was far more comprehensive than Michael had indicated. With this signature, he'd have immediate access to my bank accounts, investment portfolios, and the authority to make any financial decisions on my behalf. "This seems quite broad," I said. "Do I really need to give you this much authority?" "Mom, it's just a precaution," Michael said. "The facility requires it. And honestly, at your age, it's good to have someone younger handling the complicated financial stuff." "At my age." There was that phrase again. "What if I change my mind about Sunset Manor?" I asked. "Can this be revoked?" Michael and Jessica exchanged a quick glance. "Well, technically yes," Jessica said. "But the facility has strict policies about residents who try to leave. There are medical evaluations, waiting periods. It's complicated." Of course it was. Once I signed these papers and moved to Sunset Manor, they'd control my money and could make it very difficult for me to leave, especially if Dr. Richard Steinberg was standing by to evaluate my mental competency. "I need to think about this overnight," I said, gathering the papers. "It's a big decision." Michael's face fell. "Mom, remember we need to submit everything by tomorrow if you want the unit." "I understand. I'll have an answer for you in the morning." After they left, I called David Hartwell. "David, what can you tell me about Dr. Richard Steinberg?" Steinberg? He's a geriatric psychiatrist, specializes in competency evaluations for elderly patients. Why? My son's been paying him for consultations. There was a long pause. Sarah, Steinberg has a reputation for being accommodating to families who are concerned about an elderly relative's judgment. His evaluations tend to support whatever outcome the family is seeking. You mean he's willing to declare people incompetent for money? I couldn't say that officially, but I've seen several cases where families use Steinberg's evaluations to gain control of an elderly person's assets. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Michael and Jessica weren't just after my money. They'd developed a comprehensive plan to take it. Get me into Sunset Manor under the guise of safety and care. Use the power of attorney to access my accounts. If I resisted or tried to leave, have Dr. Steinberg declare me mentally incompetent. It was actually quite clever. If I hadn't seen Jessica poison the champagne, I might have walked right into their trap. David, I need you to prepare something for me, I said. And I need it ready by tomorrow morning. What kind of something? The kind that's going to teach my family a lesson they'll never forget. That evening, I sat in my study going over the plan one more time. Everything had to be perfect. Tomorrow, Michael and Jessica would get exactly what they deserved. But first, I had one more phone call to make. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything seem ominous, perfect for what I had planned. Michael and Jessica arrived at 9 sharp, both dressed like they were attending a business meeting, which in a way they were. Have you decided, Mom? Michael asked, settling into my living room with barely contained excitement. I have. I pulled out the Sunset Manor paperwork, now signed and notarized. I think you're right. It's time for me to start this new chapter. Jessica's relief was visible. Oh, Sarah, I'm so glad. Oh, you're going to love it there. I'm sure I will. And Michael? I've signed the power of attorney papers as well. Michael's hands actually trembled as he took the documents. This is the right decision, Mom. You won't regret it. I smiled at him. I'm sure I won't. We spent the next hour going over the financial paperwork. Jessica had a laptop open, furiously typing as I provided account numbers and access codes. Every few minutes, she'd share a meaningful look with Michael, like children who couldn't believe Christmas had come early. There's just one more thing, I said when we'd finished. I need to sign some additional paperwork with my attorney before the transfer is official. Something about tax implications for large financial transactions. Of course, Michael said. Do you want us to drive you to his office? Actually, he's coming here. David should arrive any moment. As if on cue, the doorbell rang, but it wasn't David Hartwell standing on my porch. It was Detective Lisa Morrison from the local police department, along with a colleague I didn't recognize. Mrs. Wilson, I'm Detective Morrison. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred at your home earlier this week. Michael stood up quickly. What kind of incident? A suspected poisoning, Detective Morrison said, her gaze moving between Michael and Jessica. We understand there was a medical emergency here during a party? Jessica's face had gone very pale. That was my mother. She had a reaction to her medication. The doctors said it wasn't serious. Actually, Mrs. Wilson, that's not what the hospital reported. Detective Morrison pulled out a notebook. The toxicology results show your mother ingested a concentrated amount of oleander extract. That's not a medication. It's a deadly poison. The silence in my living room was deafening. We also had the remaining champagne from that evening tested, the detective continued. The bottle that was opened for the party contained the same oleander extract. Someone deliberately poisoned that champagne. Michael was staring at Jessica with an expression of dawning horror. Jess, what did you do? I didn't do anything. Jessica's voice was shrill with panic. This is crazy. Why would I poison my own mother? That's what we're trying to figure out, Detective Morrison said. Especially since the champagne glass with the highest concentration of poison was originally intended for Mrs. Wilson here. Jessica looked like she might faint. Michael sank back into his chair, his face ashen. There's something else, I said quietly. Detective, show them the insurance policy. Detective Morrison nodded and pulled out another document. Mrs. Hartwell, we discovered you took out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Mrs. Wilson 6 months ago. That gives you a clear financial motive for murder. This is insane, Jessica whispered. Sarah, tell them this is insane. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman who'd pretended to care about me while planning my death. I saw you put the poison in my champagne glass, Jessica. I switched our drinks deliberately. Michael's head snapped up. You knew? You knew she was trying to poison you? I've known for days. I also know about your financial situation, about Dr. Steinberg, about your plan to have me declared incompetent. I know about everything. The power of attorney papers slipped from Michael's numb fingers. Mom, I didn't know about the poison. I swear to God, I didn't know she was going to try to kill you. But you knew about the rest of it, didn't you? The nursing home, the power of attorney, the plan to take my money. Michael's silence was answer enough. Detective Morrison stepped forward. Jessica Hartwell, you're under arrest for attempted murder. As they handcuffed Jessica, she turned to me with eyes full of rage. You think you're so clever, don't you? You have no idea what you've done. Actually, I said, I know exactly what I've done. After the police left with Jessica, Michael sat in my living room like a man in shock. He stared at the power of attorney papers scattered on the floor, occasionally running his hands through his hair. She said it was just about getting you somewhere safe, he said finally. She said you were becoming forgetful, making poor decisions. She convinced me you needed protection. And the money? That was about protection too? Michael's face crumpled. We're in so much debt, Mom. The business is failing. We're behind on everything. Jessica said if something happened to you naturally, we'd inherit enough to start over. But she never said anything about, he gestured helplessly. About murder? I thought we were just planning for the inevitable, getting things in place for when when I died of natural causes. How convenient that those natural causes needed a little help arriving. Michael looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Mom, I never wanted to hurt you. I studied my son's face, looking for the truth beneath the remorse. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to think that Jessica had manipulated him into this situation. But I'd been in business too long to ignore red flags. Michael, show me your phone. What? Your phone. Show me your text messages with Jessica from the past week. Michael hesitated, then reluctantly handed over his phone. I scrolled through his messages, my heart sinking with each exchange I read. Jessica, did you talk to Mom about Sunset Manor? Michael, yes. She's considering it. Jessica, good. The sooner we get her moved, the better. She's been asking too many questions about our finances. Michael, what if she changes her mind? Jessica, she won't. Not after tomorrow night. Michael, what's tomorrow night? Jessica, trust me. By Sunday she'll be begging us to take care of her. I handed the phone back to Michael. You knew, didn't you? Maybe not the specific method, but you knew Jessica was planning something for the night of the party. Michael's shoulders sagged. I thought she meant to scare you somehow. Stage a break-in maybe, or some kind of accident that would make you realize you weren't safe living alone. You thought she was going to stage my attempted murder? Not murder. Just something that would convince you to move to Sunset Manor willingly. The casual way he said it chilled me to the bone. My own son had been comfortable with the idea of traumatizing me into compliance. Michael, there's something else you need to know, I said. I had a private investigator look into your finances. His face went white. What did you find? Everything. The debt, the failed business, the fact that you've been living beyond your means for years. I pulled out Patricia's report. But there was one thing that particularly interested me. The payments to Dr. Steinberg. Mom, I can explain. Can you? Because according to this, you've been paying him to consult on my case for 3 months, before you ever suggested Sunset Manor, before you expressed any concern about my mental state. What exactly were you consulting him about, Michael? Michael buried his face in his hands. Jessica said we needed a backup plan, in case you refused to sign the power of attorney willingly. A backup plan. Steinberg agreed to evaluate you and find signs of dementia or incompetency. Jessica said it was just a precaution in case you became difficult. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent from the beginning. Only if necessary. Only if you refused to let us help you. Help me what, Michael? Help me give you my money? The truth hung in the air between us. My son, the little boy I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, had been planning to destroy my independence and steal my life's work. There's one more thing, I said quietly. The papers you signed today. The power of attorney I gave you? Michael looked up hopefully. Yes? They're fake. David prepared them specially for this meeting. They give you power of attorney over a bank account that contains exactly $1. Michael stared at me in shock. What? My real money is safely protected in trusts you can't touch. The will you're so worried about? It leaves you a modest annual income and nothing more. And if you're convicted of conspiracy in Jessica's murder plot, even that goes away. Michael's face crumpled. You've destroyed my life. No, Michael. You destroyed your own life. I just made sure you couldn't destroy mine in the process. As I watched my son sit there in ruins, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a deep, bone-weary sadness for the man he'd chosen to become. 3 months later, I sat in my garden watching the roses bloom, thinking about endings and beginnings. Jessica had been sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder. Michael received 3 years for conspiracy, though his lawyer managed to argue it down from the original charges. Emma, my granddaughter, had called the night before. At 16, she was old enough to understand what her parents had done, old enough to be horrified by their choices. "Grandma Sarah, I'm so sorry," she'd said, her voice thick with tears. "I had no idea they were planning any of this." "I know, sweetheart. None of this is your fault. Can I come visit you this summer? I know Mom and Dad are away, but I'd like to see you." "I'd love that," I'd told her, and meant it. Emma was innocent in all this, a victim of her parents' greed as much as I was. Helen Peterson had become an unexpected friend. We met for coffee twice a week now, 2 women bonded by the bizarre experience of surviving their own family's betrayal. She was considering writing a book about elder abuse, using our story as a cautionary tale. "You know," Helen said during our last coffee date, "I keep thinking about how close they came to getting away with it." "They never had a chance," I replied. "I've been dealing with people who wanted my money for 40 years. The only difference this time was that they shared my DNA." Helen laughed. "Do you ever regret how it ended, with both of them in prison?" I considered the question seriously. Did I regret it? Michael was my son, the child I'd raised and loved. But he was also a man who'd been willing to destroy my life for money. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "But I don't regret protecting myself." The doorbell interrupted my garden reverie. Through the security monitor, I could see David Hartwell standing on my porch, holding a briefcase and looking unusually pleased with himself. "David, what brings you by?" "Good news," he said, settling into my living room. "The insurance company has decided not to contest Jessica's policy on your life. Since she was convicted of attempting to murder you, they're voiding the policy and returning all premiums paid. That's something, I suppose. There's more. Michael's creditors are seizing all his assets to pay his debts. That includes the house you helped them buy. They're asking if you want to make an offer." I thought about Michael and Jessica's house, with its granite countertops and cathedral ceilings. All those beautiful things they'd wanted so desperately. "No," I said. "Let someone else have it. Someone who can afford it honestly." David nodded and pulled out another document. "The final item, your trust restructuring is complete. Your money is now protected in perpetuity. No one can access it without your explicit written consent. And if anyone attempts to have you declared incompetent, the trust automatically transfers to charity. Thank you, David, for everything." After David left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. At 70, I'd learned that money brings out both the best and worst in people. Unfortunately, it had brought out the worst in my own family. But I'd also learned something else. I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. Smart enough to see through their plans, tough enough to stop them, and resilient enough to build a new life without them. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Grandma, I got accepted to Northwestern. Pre-law, just like you suggested. Can't wait to tell you all about it when I visit." I smiled, typing back, "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Maybe that was the real victory. Not stopping Michael and Jessica's scheme, but ensuring that the next generation would have a chance to choose better. Emma would grow up knowing that money was a tool, not a goal. That family meant support and love, not exploitation and greed. The roses in my garden were blooming beautifully, tended now by a wonderful landscaping service I could easily afford. The house felt peaceful, protected by security systems and legal documents that ensured my independence. I'd started this story talking about a failed poisoning at my retirement party, but really, it was about something much more important: the difference between being old and being powerless. I might be 70, but I was far from powerless. And anyone who tried to test that theory would learn, as Michael and Jessica had, that underestimating a sharp old woman is a very expensive mistake. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and making sure the people who wronged you don't get to enjoy the fruits of their schemes. I'd done both, and I'd sleep just fine knowing it. After all, at my age, a good night's sleep is worth more than all the money in the world. The fact that I had both was just a bonus. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. Losing a child is the greatest pain a parent can endure. But when the grief becomes tangled with betrayal and humiliation, everything changes. This is my story, a journey of loss, discovery, and the fight for my dignity. Subscribe now and let me know where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what's coming next. I've always been the rock in my son's life. From the moment Mark was born, I knew my role was to guide him, protect him, and be his biggest supporter. He wasn't born into wealth, and the world wasn't kind to him. But he had ambition, and more importantly, he had me. I was his constant, his biggest cheerleader. When no one else believed in him, I did. I stood by his side through every failure, every setback, every triumph. And when he became one of the wealthiest tech entrepreneurs, I was there, quietly proud, knowing how far he had come. But life has a cruel way of reminding us that nothing is permanent. When the phone call came, I couldn't breathe. Mark had been in a car accident. The words didn't register at first. I just remember feeling a cold chill, as though the air around me had frozen. I wanted to scream, to run, to deny it all. But the truth was undeniable. My son was gone. The world seemed to collapse in on itself. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. How could this happen? Mark was supposed to be fine. He was supposed to outlive me. I had always imagined that I would die before him, my life fading quietly after years of watching him succeed. But that future was no more. At the funeral, it felt like I was walking through a fog. The mourners, the flowers, the eulogies, everything was a blur. But then I heard her voice. Charlotte, my daughter-in-law, was standing just a few feet away, talking to someone. I wasn't supposed to hear her, but I did. The words that came out of her mouth shook me to my core. "I can't wait to get rid of this old woman," she said, her voice laced with contempt. "Finally, I'll put her in an old-age home and live my life without this burden." It felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. I stood frozen, unable to process what I had just heard. My heart, already shattered by the loss of Mark, now broke all over again. She didn't even try to hide her hatred. My son's wife, the woman I had welcomed into our family, was calling me a burden. I had spent my life supporting Mark, and this was how she saw me, as a weight to be discarded. I wanted to confront her, to scream at her, but I couldn't move. I was too stunned, too crushed. The pain of Mark's death was overwhelming enough, but this was betrayal in its rawest form. I didn't know how long I stood there, but I eventually managed to pull myself away. The rest of the funeral passed in a blur, but those words from Charlotte, echoed in my mind. She wasn't just mourning my son. She was plotting my downfall. And in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her win. I wasn't going to let her throw me aside like I was nothing. This wasn't just about grieving for my son anymore. It was about survival, and I was going to fight. The anger built up inside me, and I didn't know where it would take me. All I knew was that I had to hold on to something, anything. I had already lost my child, but I wasn't going to lose myself, not to Charlotte, not to anyone. That day, my fight began. The reading of Mark's will was a blur, a surreal moment that I wasn't sure I could fully grasp. My hands shook as I sat there, surrounded by lawyers and distant relatives, the air thick with tension. The reality of his absence pressed on me from all sides. But then I heard something that left me breathless, something I never expected. Mark had named me the executor of his estate. I couldn't believe it. My son, the successful entrepreneur who had built an empire from the ground up, had entrusted me, his mother, to oversee his wealth, his legacy. I had always thought of myself as a simple woman, someone who took pride in raising a son who had achieved so much. But now, here I was, named the person responsible for his fortune. I felt an overwhelming mix of disbelief and honor. It was a trust I never knew he had in me. My mind raced, trying to process everything, but before I could fully digest the weight of that responsibility, the room's atmosphere shifted. Charlotte's face fell. She had been sitting beside me, her eyes red from crying, her grief apparently so genuine. But the moment the lawyer read her portion of the will, the facade cracked. Charlotte had expected much more. She had been Mark's wife for years, after all, but the amount she was left with, while significant, was far less than what she'd likely imagined. She had always been the picture of a loving wife, always smiling, always looking perfect in front of others. But now, her carefully controlled emotions slipped for just a moment. I watched her, the corners of her mouth tightening as the lawyer continued reading. She shifted in her seat, her hands trembling as she tried to mask the frustration beneath a forced smile. I could almost hear her thoughts. This wasn't what she'd planned for. I had been too caught up in my own grief to notice before, but now, in the cold light of the will reading, I saw the cracks in Charlotte's armor. She was not the dutiful, caring spouse she had portrayed to everyone, especially not to me. She was a woman who felt entitled to more, and that small, fleeting moment of anger was the first clear sign I had that her intentions weren't what they seemed. It wasn't just the will that had caught me off guard. It was the revelation of who Mark had trusted. He had chosen me to guard his legacy, and somehow I felt like I was being pulled into a battle that I hadn't been prepared for. But I had no choice now. Mark was gone, and I was the one left to pick up the pieces of his life. I felt a sting of guilt wash over me. Was I really the best person for this responsibility? Could I really handle this? But then, the sharp image of Charlotte's expression came to mind. I was the one Mark trusted. I had to do this. I had no choice. But it didn't take long for me to see that Charlotte wasn't going to let this go quietly. Over the following days, I began noticing more of her behavior, the way she interacted with the family, the way she spoke about Mark's business, about his money. She tried to put on the same act of sorrow and mourning, but I could see right through it. Her smile was too tight, her words too careful. I could tell she was boiling beneath the surface, plotting. At first I told myself that I was just being paranoid. The grief was clouding my judgment. But then, I overheard her speaking to one of the lawyers in a hushed voice, her words sharp and cutting. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's too old for this. How is she supposed to manage something this big? She'll mess it all up. I could feel my stomach twist as I overheard Charlotte's true feelings. She wasn't just resentful. She was already strategizing. I could tell she was trying to undermine me, trying to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to manage Mark's fortune. She wanted the estate, Mark's money, and she was willing to do anything to get it. A sickening thought crossed my mind. Was this how Mark had wanted it to go? Was he prepared for her to do whatever it took to get her hands on everything? I couldn't believe it, but now I knew. The battle wasn't just about mourning. It wasn't just about who got what in the will. It was about power, and I had to fight to keep it. The days dragged on and the pressure built. I had to organize meetings, deal with the lawyers, go over Mark's business dealings, things I never expected to have to do. But through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that Charlotte was watching, waiting for me to slip up. I started to make more notes, keeping track of every interaction, every conversation with her. I began to prepare for the worst, knowing that I had to stay sharp. Charlotte wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted, and I wasn't going to let her take everything from me, from Mark, not without a fight. As the weight of the situation grew heavier, I realized this wasn't just about managing money. It was about preserving Mark's legacy, and it was about protecting myself from someone who had proven that she was capable of anything. And as I lay awake at night, wondering what Charlotte would do next, one thought consumed me. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for my dignity, and I wasn't going to let her take that away from me too. It didn't take long for Charlotte to make her move. She was subtle at first, almost too quiet, but the tension in the air grew thicker as the days passed. I could sense her working behind the scenes, manipulating the family, speaking to lawyers, and subtly planting the idea that I was no longer capable of handling things. It wasn't just about the will anymore. It was about me, and she was making it clear that she didn't think I had the mental strength to take on the responsibility of Mark's fortune. At first, it seemed like nothing more than whispers, rumors spread in quiet corners of the house. "She's not handling this well," I overheard one of the cousins say, their voice low, almost apologetic. Another whispered, "She's getting forgetful. Maybe it's time she takes a step back." Charlotte's influence was creeping in, slowly undermining my authority, playing on the fragile emotions of grief. But it was the way she played the part of the grieving wife that really struck me. She wore her sorrow like a cloak, draped herself in black, and spoke in soft, comforting tones. I watched her cry on the phone to friends, her face contorted in what appeared to be genuine sadness. But I knew better. It was too perfect, too practiced. Her grief wasn't the kind that came from a place of deep love. It was the kind that came from a deep need for control. One evening, when the house was quiet and most of the family had left, I found Charlotte in the study with one of Mark's trusted attorneys. They were speaking in hushed tones, but I caught enough of their conversation to make my stomach turn. Charlotte was suggesting that I was losing my grip, that I was making poor decisions with Mark's business, and that it might be time for someone else to step in and handle things. Her words weren't accusations. They were manipulations, carefully placed suggestions to feed into the idea that I couldn't manage everything, that I was failing. I stood still in the hallway, just out of view, listening to her soft, controlled voice. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't even angry. She was being calculated, feeding the attorney just enough doubt to sway him, just enough doubt to have him question my ability. For a moment, I felt the ground slip beneath me. The weight of grief and responsibility was overwhelming, and I could feel my own doubts creeping in. Was she right? Was I really losing control? But then I remembered. She was playing me. This was no longer just about the inheritance. It was about breaking me down, making me doubt myself, making me feel weak, and I couldn't afford to let that happen. I knew I had to be careful. If I confronted her now, she would twist it, make it seem like I was unstable, like I was paranoid. She was a master at playing the victim, and I wasn't going to fall into her trap. So, instead of reacting, I began watching her more closely, observing her every move. It was time to gather information, to find out just how deep her schemes went. I started taking note of the little things, the way she interacted with people, the way she spoke to the lawyers, the subtle way she manipulated those around her. She was clever, but I wasn't going to let her outsmart me. The more I observed, the more I realized this wasn't just about me or the inheritance. It was about power. Charlotte had always been the picture of perfection, but now I saw the cracks in her carefully constructed image. She wasn't grieving for Mark. She was plotting. As I began to piece things together, I knew I couldn't just wait for her to make her next move. I needed to outsmart her before she took another step. I couldn't afford to let her succeed in turning everyone against me. But as the weight of this new battle settled on my shoulders, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing time. Charlotte was already a step ahead, and I was just beginning to catch up. The real game had only just begun. I had started to feel the weight of something darker pressing in on me. The whispers, the cold glares, the subtle manipulations. Everything was building towards something I couldn't quite grasp, but I could feel it in my bones. I was no longer just dealing with a grieving wife. Charlotte was playing a much deeper game, and I was her target. When I started noticing the little things, missing papers, offhand remarks from people who once respected me, and the occasional strange look from the family, it became clear that Charlotte's efforts were no longer confined to words. She was trying to break me down, but I didn't realize just how far she was willing to go until it nearly cost me my life. It was a Thursday afternoon when it happened. I was driving to the office to review Mark's business affairs, his legacy, his work. As I made my way down the winding road, I suddenly felt a strange resistance in the brakes. I pressed down harder, but instead of the smooth, familiar response, the pedal gave way with an unsettling softness. I slammed my foot down, my heart racing, but nothing happened. My car wasn't slowing down. In a split second, my mind raced. I swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding the guardrail. My hands shook on the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe it. I fought to regain control of the car, desperately trying to steer it straight. It was a miracle that I didn't crash. When I finally came to a halt, the sound of my breath filling the silence was the only thing I could hear. I sat there for a moment, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had known something was wrong, but I didn't know how far Charlotte was willing to go. Shaken, I drove the car to the mechanic's shop, my body still trembling. When I explained what had happened, the mechanic didn't even look up at first. He just started checking the brakes. But then, as he inspected the system, his expression changed. He looked at me, his face pale. "Ma'am, these brakes, they were tampered with," he said, his voice low. "It's not a mechanical failure. Someone deliberately cut the lines. This wasn't an accident." The blood drained from my face. I had suspected something, but to hear it confirmed, to know that someone had tried to kill me, it was like a punch to the gut. I couldn't bring myself to say anything for a long moment. I was too stunned. I had felt the danger, but the reality of it settled on me like a heavy weight. This wasn't just a slip-up. This wasn't some random malfunction. This was deliberate. Someone wanted me dead. The mechanic told me he would fix the car and ensure it was safe, but I was too shaken to think straight. As I sat in the waiting area, my mind raced. Who would do something like this? Who had that kind of hatred? It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Charlotte. It had to be her. I knew she wasn't someone to play fair, but this? She was willing to go that far to ensure she got what she wanted. And what she wanted wasn't just money. It was my removal. She didn't care who got hurt along the way, as long as she could take control. I was furious. The adrenaline that had kept me alive in those moments of near death now turned to raw, seething anger. She had underestimated me, though. I wasn't just going to let her walk all over me. I had already seen how manipulative she was, but now I was certain of her intentions, and I had to act. I couldn't afford to wait around, hoping she'd tire of her game. I needed answers, and I needed them fast, but I couldn't let Charlotte know I was on to her. I had to stay one step ahead of her if I wanted to protect myself and Mark's legacy. I drove home that day with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt before. The fear, the shock, all of it was still there. But something else was growing inside me too. I had nothing left to lose. The shock from the incident was still fresh, but as the days went by, a fire was igniting within me. I couldn't let this go. Someone had tried to kill me. The knowledge gnawed at my insides, and the suspicion I had felt from the start began to take shape in a way I couldn't ignore. Charlotte. I had to know the truth, and if she thought she could scare me into submission, she was gravely mistaken. I started by visiting several mechanics in the area, trying to piece together what had really happened to my car. Each one was polite, professional, and offered their best analysis, but none of them could give me a clear answer. I knew I needed to go deeper. Finally, I took the car to a small, independent mechanic, a no-nonsense type, who had a reputation for getting to the heart of problems others couldn't solve. When I explained the situation, he took a long look at the brakes and nodded, his brow furrowing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "this wasn't just a failure. Someone tampered with the system. The brake lines were cut, intentionally. This wasn't a malfunction, it's sabotage." I felt the blood drain from my face. It was one thing to have suspicions. It was another to hear it confirmed. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that I lost control of that car. This wasn't just a random act of malice. It was calculated. The mechanic's words echoed in my mind as I drove home, each turn of the wheel a reminder of the danger I'd narrowly escaped. But there was something else gnawing at me, something I couldn't shake. Charlotte had been too calm, too calculating. There was no way she would have risked leaving such a clear trail. No, she had a hand in this. But who else was she working with? I started looking into the mechanic who had supposedly fixed my car in the first place, the one who had unknowingly been part of the sabotage. It didn't take long for me to find something unsettling. His name popped up in several other unsavory dealings, loans with shady characters, brief stints working on cars for people with criminal backgrounds. My stomach churned as I realized the connection. This wasn't a simple mechanic. This man had ties to the underworld, and I couldn't help but wonder if Charlotte had used him to do her dirty work. The more I looked into it, the clearer it became. Charlotte had allies, real, dangerous people who could help her in ways I hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't just some woman angry about her inheritance. She was someone who was willing to go to great lengths, no matter the cost. I had to be smart. I couldn't just confront Charlotte. If she was working with people like this, I had to tread carefully. I couldn't risk exposing myself too soon. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. I knew I couldn't do this alone anymore. I needed someone who could dig deeper into Charlotte's past, into her connections, and into everything she had planned. I needed to know how far she was willing to go to make sure Mark's fortune ended up in her hands, and to make sure I didn't live long enough to stand in her way. The investigator, a quiet, calculating man named Leo, agreed to take on the case without hesitation. Within days, he was able to provide me with a list of names, a network of people Charlotte had been in contact with for years, people I never would have imagined she'd be involved with. And then there was the man I had suspected all along, the mechanic, who wasn't just working for Charlotte as a simple contractor, he was a pawn in her larger game. I could feel the walls closing in around me. This wasn't just about a woman trying to take what she thought was hers. This was about power, real, dangerous power. And Charlotte wasn't going to stop until she had it all. As the investigation progressed, I started to understand just how much I was up against. Charlotte wasn't just a wife with a greedy streak. She was a woman willing to destroy anyone who stood in her way. The lengths she was going to, the people she was using, it was all becoming too real. I couldn't just sit back anymore. I had to outsmart her, outplay her. The game had changed, and now I was in it, whether I liked it or not. I would have to move carefully, quietly, always a step ahead. She didn't know it yet, but she had underestimated me, and I wasn't going to let her win. The walls were closing in around Charlotte, and I knew the time had come. With the help of Leo, the private investigator, the puzzle pieces were slowly falling into place. The car sabotage was only the tip of the iceberg. The more we dug, the clearer it became that Charlotte had set her sights on Mark's fortune long before his death, and she was willing to do anything to get it. She was more dangerous than I'd ever imagined, and her web of deceit was far more intricate than I had initially suspected. Every day, Leo unearthed new information, bank accounts she had secretly opened, shady dealings with businessmen who owed her favors, and the ties she had to people who lived in the shadows of society. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control. She wanted to control everything, including me. But she had underestimated me. I wasn't going to let her win. I spent sleepless nights putting together the evidence. The mechanic who had sabotaged my car? He was just one small player in a much larger game. There were emails, phone records, and testimonies from people who had witnessed Charlotte's manipulations. It was clear that her plans had been set in motion long before Mark's accident. She had been preparing to take over his life, and she had no problem using murder, betrayal, and lies to do it. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront her, face to face. The tension in the room was palpable as I sat across from Charlotte in a quiet conference room. She had no idea what was coming. Her mask of the grieving widow was still firmly in place, but I could see the unease in her eyes. She was starting to feel the heat, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. "Charlotte," I began, my voice steady, though inside I was shaking. "I know everything." Her face faltered for just a moment, but then she recovered with that practiced smile. "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" she asked, feigning innocence. "This is all too much for you right now. You're just grieving." I leaned forward, my gaze never leaving hers. "I've seen the bank transfers, the secret accounts. I know about the mechanic, the sabotage. You thought you could kill me and get away with it." She stiffened, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "You're insane," she spat, trying to regain control. "None of that is true. You've lost your mind. This is all in your head." I pushed a stack of papers toward her. The evidence was irrefutable. The mechanic's records, emails with her associates, a series of phone calls that led straight back to her. It all pointed to one thing. She was behind the entire plot. I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was a woman fighting for her life. "You thought you could take everything, didn't you?" I continued. My voice sharp. "The money, the power, everything Mark built. You were willing to let me die, to kill my son, just to get what you wanted. But I'm not going anywhere, not without a fight." Charlotte's mask cracked. For a brief moment, I saw the real woman beneath, the desperate, vindictive creature who had been lying to everyone, including herself. She tried to stand, but the words came tumbling out before she could get away. "All right," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "You want the truth? Fine. I did it. I planned everything. Mark was in my way, and you were just an obstacle. I had to get rid of you, and the car. That was just the beginning. I was going to make sure you were out of the picture, but you're too stubborn, too resilient." The door swung open, and Leo walked in, followed by 2 police officers. Charlotte's face went pale as they moved toward her, the truth finally catching up with her. She tried to stand and run, but one of the officers grabbed her arm, pulling her back down into the chair. "No!" Charlotte screamed, her voice rising in panic. "You can't do this! You don't understand! I deserve this! I've worked so hard for it! All of this! It was supposed to be mine!" As the officers placed her in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The woman who had been pulling the strings, the one who had manipulated everyone around her, was finally being exposed for who she really was. But there was no joy in it. As they led Charlotte away, I felt the weight of everything settle on my shoulders. I had won the battle, but the war had cost me so much. Mark was gone, and there was no way to fill the hole in my heart. I had fought for his legacy, for his name, but I couldn't bring him back. The victory felt hollow. I walked out of the room, the sounds of Charlotte's protests fading behind me. But the relief was short-lived. I had lost my son, and no amount of money or power could ever change that. Still, as I walked out of that building, I knew that I had done the right thing. I had fought for Mark, I had fought for me, and I had won. But nothing could ever replace the loss of the one person who mattered most. For a few days after Charlotte's arrest, a semblance of peace settled over me. It was a brief moment of calm, a false sense of security. I could breathe again, or at least I thought I could, but the quiet didn't last long. Even behind bars, Charlotte wasn't finished with me. I should have known. I should have expected it. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. I began to receive strange, anonymous letters, carefully written threats, some vague, others more direct. They spoke of ruining my reputation, of bringing everything to light, and they all had a single, terrifying implication. Charlotte's revenge was underway. It wasn't until I began to piece things together that the true extent of her retaliation became clear. While she was locked away in prison, Charlotte had been making calls I never could have imagined she had access to. She'd reached out to her allies, to the ones still loyal to her from the shadows, the ones who had helped her along the way. The mechanic, the one who had been part of the sabotage plot, wasn't the only one in her pocket. She had connections everywhere, and I was just beginning to understand the depth of her reach. Charlotte was using coded messages to send instructions to her associates outside the prison walls. She had created a network of people who would do her bidding, no questions asked. Through back channels and hidden messages, she had started to manipulate the situation, working relentlessly to destroy my credibility. Soon, I started hearing whispers, rumors that I was involved in frauds much bigger than anyone realized. Whispers that I had been embezzling funds, falsifying accounts, and scheming behind the scenes to steal from Mark's company. The more I heard, the more I realized what Charlotte was doing. She was trying to smear my name, to paint me as a criminal, and to make me look like the one who had been dishonest all along. At first, I dismissed it as just another part of her game, another ploy to weaken me. But the rumors began to grow. They spread like wildfire, seeping into the press, into the business world, and even among friends and colleagues I had trusted for years. It wasn't just gossip anymore. People were starting to question me. They were starting to doubt everything I had worked for. The pressure mounted, and the threats kept coming. I couldn't go a day without hearing from someone, either a new anonymous message, a warning, or a phone call from someone who had heard the rumors. Charlotte was doing everything she could to ruin me, even from behind bars. She wasn't going to let me take everything from her without a fight, but I wasn't going to let her win. I felt the weight of the situation pressing on me, but instead of succumbing to the fear, I began to feel something else, a burning determination. If Charlotte thought she could break me, she was wrong. I had come too far to let her tear everything down now. I had lost Mark, and the last thing I was going to do was let his legacy be destroyed by her lies. I needed to act quickly. I needed to turn the tables before Charlotte's plan could fully take hold. I started seeking allies in places I never would have imagined. People who had previously been loyal to Charlotte's side, lawyers, former associates, began to turn, sensing that her manipulations were more self-serving than they had initially realized. I reached out to them, offering them the truth. It was a delicate game. I had to be careful. I couldn't trust anyone blindly. But I knew that if I wanted to stop Charlotte's plan in its tracks, I needed to gather the right pieces, solid evidence, names, documents, and I needed to strike before she could destroy me publicly. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure only grew. The rumors continued to swirl, but so did my quiet efforts to counteract them. Slowly, I gathered proof, small but crucial pieces of information that could expose the lies Charlotte had planted. I had her figured out, and I wasn't about to let her destroy me with her games. And then, just as I thought I had a clear path to turn the tide, Charlotte made her next move. I received an anonymous package. Inside was a series of falsified documents, carefully crafted to make it appear as though I had been embezzling from Mark's company. There were forged signatures, altered bank records, and accounting discrepancies that looked too real to ignore. It was Charlotte's final attempt to frame me, to destroy my reputation once and for all. But she had made one critical mistake. She underestimated me. I had already seen this coming. I had anticipated her move. What Charlotte didn't know was that I had been working in the shadows too, collecting my own evidence. The documents she sent me were nothing but a trap, and I had already secured the proof to expose them as forgeries. Now, it was time to act. I wasn't just going to fight for my name. I was going to take the fight to Charlotte and make sure she could never manipulate anyone again. I had the truth, I had the evidence, and most importantly, I had the strength to end this once and for all. The game had changed, and this time, I was in control. It was time to make my move. Charlotte had always been a woman who thrived on control, and after her arrest, I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. The prison walls may have held her for a while, but it didn't take long before her resources, those dark, shadowy connections she'd cultivated for years, came into play. With the help of her loyal allies, Charlotte managed to secure her release on bail. And when she walked back into the world, it was with more hatred in her eyes, a thirst for revenge that seemed deeper than ever. She didn't just want to get rid of me anymore. She wanted to ruin me, destroy my very existence. It was personal now. She had lost the first round, but she wasn't about to go down without a brutal retaliation. The rumors she had started before, the ones that had tarnished my name, were nothing compared to the vicious lies she now spread. This time, she went straight to the press, and it wasn't just whispers in dark corners, it was front-page news. The headlines screamed that I was a fraud, a manipulator, that I had used my late son's business for my own personal gain. She painted me as a villain, the mastermind behind a series of financial schemes, and worse yet, she used every tool at her disposal to make sure her lies gained traction. Charlotte, with her calm, calculated demeanor, positioned herself as the innocent victim, the grieving wife who had been wronged by a woman who had wormed her way into her husband's legacy. The media ate it up, and influential figures who had once stood by me began to question everything. The trust I had built over the years started to crack. Her influence was growing, and it seemed like I was losing ground fast. But as the pressure mounted, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about taking control of this narrative, once and for all. Charlotte thought she had me cornered, but I knew better, knew. She had underestimated me, and now it was my turn to turn the tables. I didn't rush in like I had before. I knew this battle would require patience, strategy, and precision. I started to use the same tactics she had mastered, manipulation, but with purpose. I began to weave a web of my own. Only this time, I wasn't alone. I worked in the shadows, pulling strings, reaching out to former allies of Charlotte, people who had grown disillusioned with her games. Slowly, I started to build a network of people who could help me expose her. As I gathered these pieces, I also kept a close eye on Charlotte. I knew she was still trying to manipulate Mark's fortune, trying to wrestle control from me. She thought she could play the game, but I was better at it than she realized. Every move she made, every attempt to discredit me, was just another layer of her web that I could unravel. I used Charlotte's own tactics against her, spreading seeds of doubt among her closest allies. I fed them small but telling bits of information, carefully designed to make them question her motives, her loyalty. I knew that if I could make her own people doubt her, the rest of her empire of lies would crumble. It wasn't enough to just expose Charlotte. I needed to destroy her credibility, to make sure no one would ever believe a word she said again. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing that I was playing her game, but in the background, I was moving the pieces in place. I had everything I needed: the evidence, the alliances, and most importantly, the control. And then, just as I thought I had the upper hand, Charlotte made her move. I received a call late one evening. It was from one of her remaining allies, someone I had been watching carefully, someone who had previously turned against Charlotte, but was now slipping back into her influence. He told me that Charlotte was planning one final devastating blow. She was going to accuse me of embezzling directly from Mark's company, using forged documents to implicate me in crimes that would completely erase my credibility. This wasn't just another rumor. This was Charlotte's final attempt to take me down once and for all. It was going to be big, and it was going to be ugly. But by now, I was ready. I had anticipated this move, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. I contacted my lawyer and the private investigator, Leo. Together, we had already set a trap. We had been gathering everything we needed to counter Charlotte's accusations. The documents she planned to use against me? We already had copies of them, and we knew they were fakes. Nothing more than an elaborate forgery, designed to destroy my life. I had my proof, my strategy, and my allies. Charlotte had played her cards, and now it was time to expose her for the fraud she truly was. The battle between us was only getting started, and I could feel the tension building, the stakes rising with each passing day. But this time, I wasn't going to be the one who lost. The game had changed, and I was in control now. The final confrontation was coming, and I was ready. Now that Charlotte was out on bail, the stakes had escalated. The game was no longer about subtle manipulations or whispered rumors. Charlotte had shed her disguise of the grieving widow, and in its place was a woman who had fully embraced the dark side of power. She wasn't just trying to salvage her image anymore. She was determined to destroy mine. She wasn't playing by the rules anymore. With her freedom came access to people and resources that I couldn't easily counter. She had reconnected with powerful figures, influential businessmen, and high-profile attorneys who could help her bury me with the weight of their influence. Charlotte was no longer the desperate woman trying to keep her hold on an inheritance. Now, she was a force to be reckoned with, and she was using every tool at her disposal to ensure that her version of the truth became the only one people believed. It was getting dangerous. I could feel her growing more aggressive in her tactics, more unpredictable. She was willing to do whatever it took to control the narrative, and she wasn't afraid to use manipulation and fear to get her way. She wanted to break me, to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that no one would ever listen to me again. But I had learned from her. She had shown me how the game was played, and now it was my turn to play it better. I had to think strategically. I couldn't afford to react with the same rage or desperation she had. I had to be calm, calculating, and above all, patient. I wasn't going to let Charlotte dictate the pace of this battle. No, this time, I was in control. I began to shift the dynamics of the game. I moved carefully, subtly, and behind the scenes. I started to isolate Charlotte, one step at a time. She had made enemies without even realizing it. People who were growing tired of her manipulations. People who had once followed her, but now saw her for what she truly was. It wasn't immediate, but over time I started to expose her lies, one crack in her armor at a time. But I wasn't going to reveal everything all at once. I couldn't afford to. I knew that if I did, Charlotte would find a way to turn it all back on me. Instead, I dropped pieces of the puzzle strategically, making sure that when the time came, her web of deceit would unravel in front of everyone, and she wouldn't even know who to trust. I began to forge alliances with people who had once been under Charlotte's spell. Some of them had been her close allies, but now they were questioning her motives, questioning the lies they had been told. I didn't approach them with force or anger. I approached them with truth, with facts, and most importantly, with a promise. I offered them an alternative. They could stand by Charlotte, a woman who had shown herself to be ruthless and manipulative, or they could stand with me, someone who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. Little by little, I started to win people over. I didn't need to sway everyone at once. I just needed enough of them to see the cracks in Charlotte's facade. And the more I chipped away, the more her influence began to slip, unnoticed by her, like a rope unraveling one strand at a time. As the walls around her began to close in, Charlotte grew more desperate. She didn't know who was turning on her. She didn't know that her own allies were beginning to question her. She was still focused on me, thinking that I was the only one standing in her way. But what she didn't realize was that her grip on everything she had worked so hard to control was slipping, and she couldn't do a thing to stop it. I knew the time for the final confrontation was coming. The truth would come out, piece by piece, until she had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. And when that moment came, I would be ready. But for now, I continued my slow, strategic advance, exposing Charlotte's lies bit by bit, undermining her at every turn. I let her think she was still in control while I prepared to strike at the right moment. She was losing ground, and she didn't even know it yet. Every lie she told, every manipulation she made, was slowly turning against her. The power balance was shifting, and she hadn't realized that she was already losing. The game was far from over, but the end was drawing closer. And this time, I was the one in control. Charlotte was unraveling, and it was no surprise that in her desperation, she went all in. Every tactic she had used before, every lie, every whisper, had failed. She had no more time to play the waiting game, no more patience left. Now, she was making one last attempt to crush me once and for all. She started spreading more vicious rumors, but this time, they were more dangerous. She accused me of crimes far worse than anyone could have imagined. Embezzling millions, hiding assets overseas, being the mastermind behind a string of fraudulent dealings that even the closest family members had no idea about. She was throwing everything at me, hoping something would stick, hoping the press would latch on to her accusations like they had before. The lies she spread weren't just about the inheritance anymore. This time she was aiming to destroy me completely, to put me in a position where I could never defend myself. She wanted to make sure that no one would ever believe my side of the story. The press once again seemed to fall for it. They loved a scandal, especially one that involved high-profile families and vast fortunes. But I wasn't about to let her destroy me like this. For all the damage Charlotte was trying to inflict, I had already anticipated this move. I knew what she would try to do. She was cornered, and in her desperation, she made one mistake after another, leaving openings that I could exploit. I started acting quickly, using everything I knew about her. I used the evidence I had quietly gathered, hidden emails, bank records, conversations that proved Charlotte had been manipulating the family for years, skimming money from Mark's businesses, and using her charm to get people to do her bidding. With every accusation she threw at me, I threw back a piece of evidence that exposed her lies. I didn't react in anger or panic, as she had hoped. Instead, I calmly laid the facts bare for everyone to see. I contacted the media, sent my lawyer to meet with influential figures, and slowly, without fanfare, the truth began to emerge. Charlotte was no longer the grieving widow who had been betrayed. She was the manipulator, the mastermind who had been behind every lie, every underhanded scheme. The more I revealed, the clearer it became that Charlotte had been orchestrating the whole thing. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about power, control, and keeping a tight grip on everything Mark had built. But now, those very people who had once supported her were beginning to doubt her. The truth had a way of doing that. People started seeing her for what she was, a woman who would stop at nothing, even if it meant ruining everyone in her path. And then came the moment of clarity. Charlotte made her final, desperate attempt to discredit me, thinking she could end it all in one stroke. She organized a press conference, bringing all her allies together to make an accusation so grand that it would surely bury me. The accusation was simple, but devastating. She claimed that I had manipulated Mark's entire fortune, that I had used my influence over him to bleed the company dry. It was a bold move, but one she didn't count on. I had already anticipated this, and while Charlotte was busy trying to control the narrative, I had been quietly securing my own defense. Tangible, irrefutable proof that would expose Charlotte as the real villain. As she took the stage, ready to throw the final punch, I made my move. In a single, calculated moment, I presented the documents to the press, to the world. It wasn't just proof of her lies. It was evidence of her crimes, her manipulation, and her abuse of power. I showed how she had tried to manipulate the will, falsify documents, and engineer a series of events to destroy me and take everything for herself. The press, which had once been so eager to believe her lies, now had no choice but to confront the truth. Charlotte's face turned pale as she realized what had happened. She was no longer the victim. She was exposed. The ground she thought she stood on started crumbling beneath her feet, and I watched as everything she had built began to fall apart. Her lies had caught up with her, and she couldn't escape anymore. In a final act of desperation, Charlotte tried to flee, but it was too late. The authorities were already on their way, ready to confront her with the full extent of her manipulations. She had tried to destroy me, but she had only sealed her own fate. As the police took her away, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. I had fought for my name, for Mark's legacy, and I had won. But the victory wasn't sweet. It was hard-won, and the cost had been higher than I could have imagined. Charlotte had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, it was her own lies that did her in. And as I stood there, watching the woman who had caused so much pain and destruction being led away, I knew that the battle was over, but the scars would never fully heal. With the truth now laid bare, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with terrifying clarity. I had spent months gathering evidence, carefully documenting every lie, every deceit, and every crime Charlotte had committed. Now, all of it was in the open, exposed for everyone to see. I called a family meeting, a gathering that would shake the very foundations of everything Charlotte had worked so hard to build. I didn't need to do this alone. I brought with me trusted figures from Mark's inner circle, lawyers, family members, and influential business figures who had witnessed Charlotte's manipulations firsthand. It was time to reveal it all, to expose the monster she had become. As they gathered in the room, I laid out the full extent of her betrayal. I started with the sabotage of Mark's car, the violent, deliberate act that had almost killed me. I showed them the evidence, the mechanic's testimony, the records of the tampered brakes. Then, I moved to the financial manipulations, the accounts she had secretly opened, the forged documents she had used to siphon money from Mark's empire, and the network of lies she had woven to convince the family and the business that she was the victim. And of course, I didn't leave out the most damning evidence, the plot to have me killed in that car accident. Charlotte had gone to unimaginable lengths to take everything from me, to destroy Mark's legacy and claim it for herself. The room was silent as the weight of the revelations settled in. It felt as if the ground beneath me shifted, and for the first time, I saw the full scope of what Charlotte had tried to do. Her lies were too big to ignore, and as the pieces came together, her carefully constructed image began to crumble. The family members who had once supported her now stared at her with disbelief. Charlotte, the woman they had all believed was the innocent widow, the grieving wife, was no longer the person they thought they knew. She tried to protest, to deny everything, but it was too late. The truth was undeniable, and her lies were no longer believable. As she stood there, her face flushed with rage and desperation, she knew the game was up, but still, she couldn't stop herself from trying to flee. She tried to run, to escape the consequences of her actions, but the police had already been alerted. The officers arrived at the perfect moment, just as Charlotte was making a final, frantic attempt to leave the room. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, and she was pulled away, kicking and screaming. There was no escape for her now, no more manipulation, no more lies. Charlotte's reign of terror had come to an end. As the police took her into custody, I stood frozen, watching the woman who had caused so much damage to my life and my family being led away. There was a strange, bittersweet feeling that washed over me. I had won. I had fought for Mark's legacy, for my own dignity, and I had prevailed. But the victory didn't feel like a triumph. I had lost so much. Mark was gone, and no amount of revenge could ever bring him back. His absence was a void that no victory, no amount of money could ever fill. The relief that came with Charlotte's arrest was tempered by the ache of that emptiness. As I looked around at the faces of those who had once stood by her side, I couldn't shake the feeling of something missing. The battle had cost me more than I could ever have imagined. I had fought for survival, for the truth, and for my own sense of justice. But the scars of this battle would never fade. I had done what I had to do. Charlotte was finally held accountable, her web of lies exposed, and I could now breathe free from the suffocating weight of her manipulation. But the price of this victory, of everything I had lost, was something I would carry with me forever. The truth had won, but it hadn't erased the pain. It hadn't brought Mark back, and as I walked away from the courtroom, the weight of that truth settled in, and I understood that freedom, while earned, came at a cost. The days following Charlotte's arrest were a blur, the weight of everything that had happened slowly sinking in. The battle for Mark's fortune, the lies, the manipulation, everything that had consumed my life for so long, was finally over. Charlotte was locked away, her schemes exposed for the world to see, and I was left with the pieces of a life that had been shattered. I looked at my reflection in the mirror one morning and realized that the woman staring back at me was not the same woman who had walked into this battle. I had fought, I had survived, and in the process, I had lost more than I ever could have imagined. The fortune, the business, those things were important, yes, but they were nothing compared to what I had truly lost. Mark, my son, the man I had poured my love and hope into for so many years. The grief was still there, always there, a weight on my chest. No matter how much I had fought, no matter how much I had achieved, nothing could bring him back. The emptiness lingered. There would never be a day when I wouldn't miss him. But amidst the sorrow, there was something else, something quiet but undeniable. I had done what I set out to do, not just for the money, not just for revenge, but for Mark's legacy. I had protected what he had built, and I had kept his memory alive. That was the one thing Charlotte couldn't take from me, no matter how hard she tried. But as I sat in the silence of my home, I realized that what I had truly gained wasn't wealth or victory. It was freedom. Freedom from the chains that had bound me for so long. Freedom from Charlotte's manipulation, from the fear, from the constant battle for survival. I was free, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe without the weight of that constant pressure hanging over me. With my newfound clarity, I began to think about what I truly wanted from the rest of my life. I had always wanted to do something meaningful, to help those who had been through what I had, women who had been manipulated, abused, and silenced. I had watched so many women suffer in the shadows, too afraid to speak out, too afraid to take control of their own lives. I decided that it was time to stop waiting, to stop letting fear control me. I took the steps to establish a foundation in Mark's name, a foundation that would provide support for women who had suffered emotional manipulation, financial abuse, and oppression. It was something I had always wanted to do. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.